Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm Reagan Sonneban. I am an entrepreneur, a small business owner, and a real estate investor. So today I am so excited to have on the podcast, on the YouTube channel, my friend and Illinois State Representative, Mary Beth Canty. Thanks for
Hello.
coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So excited to have Mary Beth today. So, guys, we are sitting in the Arlington Heights Memorial Library, which is really something I've personally underutilized most of the time that I've lived here.
It is not just for reading books. You can run whole businesses out of the library. It's great.
So true. Absolutely. They actually have multiple studios that you can rent. We're in one of the conference rooms. There's, I don't know, maybe 10 of these small
Easily.
conference room that accommodate up to 5 people. Then they have some others that accommodate up to 16. They have a couple of even larger rooms.
Yeah.
The studios I'm a huge fan of. So in any case, we decided we would wanted to meet here and do our little interview today. So I've known Mary Beth for years, from
Long time.
before she was elected to any office
Yeah.
or anyone that I knew.
Yeah.
But first to Arlington Heights Village Trustee, and then later to Illinois State Representative. But over the period of time that we've known each other, we've really shared an interest in multiple causes. I mean, more causes than I can count,
I
probably.
think that's right.
And so,
All of the ones that fill your heart.
absolutely. So true. So I think we probably first interacted when our kids were at Olive Mary Stitt through the PTA. I know for me, running Ecology Club and then just kind of meeting in that way, but, also realizing more and more over time this alignment and, values and issues and all of those things. And of course, you've joined me for some events at nonprofits, things like that.
Which I'm
So
always happy to do.
absolutely. So it really has been delightful. And, I knew that as I was interviewing people and kind of, still new to the podcast and the YouTube channel, but, I've just been interviewing people that I know and that I'm just like always wowed by, basically. And you're one of those people.
Oh, you wow me too.
Thank you. So today is Mary Beth's birthday. So very exciting, happy, and flattered to be a part of her day on her birthday. But basically I just wanted to kind of have a conversation that we normally naturally have and ask you about some things particularly that relate to real estate and a lot of the investors that I know and myself as well. I know we had talked about not too long ago, and maybe for the first time even a year and a half, 2 years ago, things related to affordable housing. And it's really much more on my own personal radar in a different way today than it was when we first talked about it, which is what made me think about it not that long ago when I reached out and I'm like, hey, I want to have you on my podcast.
Yeah.
So Mary Beth has really been a part of some important legislation related to both locally and at a state level related to affordable housing. And I know here in Arlington Heights, I can remember us having conversations years ago that, there are regulations about when new development takes place, there's a certain percentage that needs to be affordable housing. I think there's been a case where sometimes people kind of try to buy their way out of that.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Right. So when I first joined the village board, affordable housing was actually part of the reason that I decided to run in the first place. So, one of the beautiful things about where we live is we have this mix of properties, right? You can have a little 2-bedroom, 1-bath ranch house, kind of a starter home or one that you can retire into if you want to age in place. And then they range all the way up to, a multi-million-dollar house all in one community. And I think that is brilliant. But one of the things I started to notice was we were losing some of that lower end cost housing in terms of our single family housing. And so what would happen is these homes that were, $250,000, $300,000 would get purchased, torn down, and then something else would go up in their place that was now $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. And it really opened my eyes to what was happening around me and thinking about how do we keep that diversity of housing stock. So I ran for village board. I got onto that board in 2019. In 2020, we put in place an affordable housing ordinance. So before the ordinance, a developer might come in, mostly of rental projects, apartment buildings, and we would say, well, the village would say, we recommend that you have X number of brick and mortar units out of your development that are affordable housing units. And the developer would say, okay, well, I can't really afford to do that. So what if I pay, a fee in lieu? And that's what we call it, the fee in lieu. And they would pay that into our affordable housing trust. And part of the problem was we hadn't, as a village, as a community, figured out how we were going to use that affordable housing trust.
Okay.
And so then you didn't know how to negotiate with the developer. So if they say, I'm going to pay $5,000 per unit in a fee in lieu, is that a good amount? I don't know. It depends on what you're trying to use it for. Are we trying to raise enough funds that we can ultimately buy affordable units? Are we trying to help subsidize rent for people who might not otherwise be able to afford to live in one of the units? It really, the amount that you would need in terms of a fee in lieu depends on what you're trying to do with the funds that you raise.
Got it.
And so with the ordinance, we were one of only 7 communities across the state to create one of these ordinances. And so it laid out for various areas in the village. So sort of radiating out from our downtown. So the downtown is transit oriented development, right? It's close to the train. It's really dense. You get a lot of units. There's 1% of brick and mortar units required.
Okay.
And the fee in lieu, if you're not going to provide those units, is set. And then it radiates out from that. And it also varies based on the number of total units that you are trying to create. And the goal there was for developers to have certainty with what we require as a village and what we need, and for the village to be able to have certainty over what they were going to get from developers in terms of housing stock and the affordable housing trust, right?
Okay.
And one of the questions that I asked as a board member, I was like, we are talking a lot about rental units, but we do have an issue with our for purchase single family homes, either the standalone or the connected homes. We have row homes and townhomes, and and you and I have talked about this before. One of the hardships with that is controlling other people's private property, right? And the whole point of being able to buy a home is that you're building generational wealth. Right? You are building equity. The goal is you buy something and then you're able to then sell it for more than you paid for it, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's a hard thing to balance through ordinance to make sure that you have that stock available without hindering people's ability to do the American dream and build that generational wealth.
Got it. That's it. When you mention that, that really is a consideration I had not thought about, because I've heard of other similar ordinances in different places, especially places maybe that are more vacation oriented, and it's through the roof, and it's like, where are the people the workforce, where are they going to live?
A lot of times they get pushed out.
Exactly. Okay, let's pivot for a minute. I know we've talked about some other things. I feel like we end up kind of winding,
it's the nature of the beast, right?
Absolutely. But just kind of thinking about some things that relate to that. I know we talked not too long ago about, for myself and for other investors, not developers, but just that thinking about various things related to crime-free acts, related to landlord friendliness, related to the tax level, as far as if someone wants to buy a property in Illinois versus maybe a neighboring state. Any kind of thoughts about what would make an investor want to buy in Illinois as opposed to a neighboring state?
So I think there are a lot of reasons to invest in Illinois, right? We are centrally located to the rest of the country. We've got great transit, great education, right? We have a lot of access, and frankly, access to fresh water, right? So as we're thinking about all of the implications of that, Illinois is a great place to be. And I think one of the other things that we're trying to be mindful of.
Mm-hmm.
And we worked on legislation around this last year. It is around crime-free housing ordinances.
Mm-hmm.
So on their face, those might seem like they're really great,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you don't want neighborhoods that are filled with crime. We should
Sure.
be looking to make everyone's lives better, right? The issue becomes when you implement those ordinances, they are usually agnostic as to why there is a police presence. And so you might be stopping the very behavior that you actually want to see, right? So a domestic violence survivor might be afraid to call the police to report their abuser because they don't want to lose their housing. Or someone is afraid to report a crime that they saw happen on the street because it means that there's going to be a police presence and they might lose their housing, right? So we don't want people to be unhoused. And then the other side of that is actually related to the landlords and property owners themselves. So a lot of folks that own those properties, they also hold a license as brokers, as realtors, and they have to follow federal law. And federal law says that you can't kick someone out of their property, out of their housing, just because the police have been called, right?
Okay.
And the ordinances were agnostic as to whether or not the person had committed a crime. It was just the mere fact that the police had been called, in some cases, as limited as 3 times.
Oh, wow.
Right? In a span. And so if you're an investor and you're thinking, I don't want to put my license at risk by buying this property and then having to either comply with municipal ordinance or federal law, right? You are going to get nervous. And so the Realtors Association actually joined forces with our housing advocates to try and do away with these crime-free housing ordinances, not because anyone wants to see more crime or make that a possibility, but recognizing this is a hindrance both to the economic development of the area and to people having safe housing.
Interesting. And it's when we first started talking about this not too long ago, you brought up something that had not occurred to me either, or I don't know if you actually said it, or maybe I interpreted what you were saying in a different way. But essentially, what my thought process after that was that this could actually contribute to homelessness as well, because you have people who can't get into a home because they can't get approved.
Correct. So we do see that a lot, right? And I think that's a bigger and broader issue too with our criminal justice system and how we get people to re-enter the system.
Sure.
When we are restricting where folks can live and then we're excluding them or we're kicking them out of their housing, there are limited options that people can afford to go to, right? And so it creates dangerous situations for people where they are either unhoused or they might resort to doing something that they might otherwise not if they had a safe place to live, right? And we all know to get a job, it's a lot easier when you have a safe place to live where you can rest, iron your clothes, keep your work uniform, eat, right? If you don't have those things, it's a lot harder to maintain a job. It's not impossible, but it is a lot harder. And so if you can't maintain a job, these are things that sort of compound on themselves. So a lot of our root issues relate to housing access and making sure that people have a safe and secure place to live.
Excellent. I think, or not excellent, but at least that explanation, understanding how some of these things are actually much bigger issues than what they may seem on the surface. Interesting. Now, thinking about other things that relate particularly to the state of Illinois, and I think, are issues in other places as well. I know we were talking earlier about co-living and, some of the restrictions, ordinances, things like that related to how many people that are unrelated can live in a particular dwelling together. Any thoughts or, things that you would want to share related to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, over time, we're able in different areas to sort of look at those. I think some of them are holdovers, right? So you see this a lot in college towns. You know, a sorority might tell you that they can't have a sorority house, right? Because you can't have X number of young women all co-living in one space. It can be considered a brothel. Doesn't matter that it's not really a brothel, right? But that creates a hardship. But I do think there are other concerns at play, and some of it is a little bit of NIMBYism. And I also think there is some element of wanting to protect access to safe housing, right? So we want to be mindful that there is such a thing as space limitations, right? So is your ordinance there looking at the amount of space that is in the housing and putting limitations in that way, because you want to make sure that we don't have folks that are, unsavory. You're not an unsavory person, but there are unsavory actors who will just put as many people into a living space as they possibly can because they can charge for that, right? And so you hear horror stories of someone who's living in, a very small converted walk-in closet and paying for that, right? Because there are so many people living in the space. We want to be careful about that because those are unsafe living conditions. Some of it is holdovers from when we saw very obvious redlining across communities. So I think you have to look at each one of those ordinances, figure out why it's there, who it's designed to protect, and then can we protect that group of people, that group of usually, I would say, residents? Can we make sure that they are protected in a way that also makes sense with the way that we live now?
Got it. Wow, the brothel thing really kind of was a bit of a light bulb.
So when I was in college, there was a series of houses where it was campus housing because the campus, the university, could own the homes. The sorority could own the first floor, the common space, but not the bedrooms. And so that was sort of the way they worked around the brothel part of the housing ordinances in the community. But, I do think sometimes things are just left over and we need to take a second look at those and go, is this really working the way that it should, or is it just throwing up barriers to things that we actually need? And we haven't really talked about this, but one of the things I think about is the funding for building affordable housing is one of the most heavily regulated areas. It's actually really hard for affordable housing to get built, not just because of NIMBYs in a community or folks saying that they don't want it, but truly we make the process very hard to get that funding. And so that's an area that I think is ripe for a change. We know that there's a shortage of housing.
Yes.
That is just absolutely true. It's true in Illinois. It is true across the nation. One of the ways that we can work against that is by building more housing. But in order to build more housing, we're going to have to make sure that there is funding access and access to lenders in a way that protects everybody and makes sure that, nonprofits are doing what they're supposed to do, but also give them the opportunity to actually build the housing. Affordable housing is some of the most expensive housing to build in the nation.
Interesting. That's kind of ironic.
It is, right?
And as you kind of lay that out, it strikes me that it could be an opportunity for public-private partnership.
Yes.
So what kinds of things do you think could happen there?
So I think where we see affordable housing go up, a lot of times it is due to the help of public-private partnerships. And it's the way that we talk about affordable housing. I think that still has sort of a negative connotation when we say affordable housing, right? And so it's really about housing affordability and making sure that communities understand what we're doing, and then going back and looking at the regulatory schema around the financing and saying, okay, this regulation is smart, it makes sense, that would apply regardless of what type of housing you were building. This other one maybe less so.
Mhm.
We're doing that because we were trying to throw up a roadblock to
Okay.
building certain types of housing. And I don't know that we always need those roadblocks. So
Right.
where can we lift that and make it easier for people to move forward?
Well, and it's interesting too that you said affordable housing is some of the most expensive housing to build. So, what are some of the contributing factors to that, other than what you just mentioned?
A lot of it is the regulatory schema
Mhm.
around the financing of
Mhm.
it. And there are federal programs. A
Mhm.
lot of those require certain types of matching that is
Mm.
hard to get to in your state or municipality, right? There's not a lot of free flowing cash
Mhm.
going around, but they don't, the funding schema doesn't always allow you to do it through a private partnership. And so,
Mhm.
how can we make those programs easier
Mhm.
to access, more
Mhm.
well known, so that people can actually do the drawdown of the federal dollars?
Wow, interesting. And then, another thing we haven't actually talked about yet is Section 8.
Mhm.
How would you see Section 8 impacting like our area or the state as a whole?
So that's another interesting one. I think especially out here,
Hmm.
right? We're in a more affluent area, a lot of single family
Hmm.
homes. And so what people think they know of Section 8 housing or housing vouchers is that, it's what they see on TV or
Hmm.
movies,
Hmm.
right? And it's just not the case
Hmm.
anymore. And I think we have to do a better job of removing that stigma. A
Hmm.
Section 8 housing voucher,
Hmm.
that people wait years
Hmm.
to get off the waiting list to be eligible
Hmm.
to get one of these. But from a rent from a landlord perspective,
Hmm.
I think that's actually a really great program
Hmm.
because it's actually not asking you to take less
Hmm.
in rent. It's
Hmm.
making up the difference
Hmm.
in the rent. So from a landlord perspective, I think that's guaranteed money
Right.
in a lot of ways, right?
Hmm.
And so if you can scatter that type of housing
Hmm.
within your market rate,
Hmm.
within your more affordable units,
Hmm.
now you've got a nice, healthy mix of people. You don't have buildings that are falling into
Hmm.
disrepair,
Sure.
which I think is what people picture.
Hmm.
Part of the reason they picture that is because historically there have been unsavory actors, but also folks don't always have a voice,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so if their unit or if their building falls into disrepair, they aren't going to be the ones that have money and can sue and do all these things. So it's
Hmm.
easy to
Hmm.
ignore them. It's easy to let their units fall into
Hmm.
disrepair. But if it's mixed throughout,
Hmm.
then everyone is uplifted. Your whole community is uplifted. And I think you don't see those types of issues, but it really is a community effort.
Sure. Well, and I know there are a lot of investors that specifically focus on Section 8.
Mhm.
And I think there's, different, like learning anything new, you kind of learn the pros and the cons and how to navigate different aspects of it. But, I think that there's a lot of potential there for, making equality throughout the community.
I think so too. Section 8, it's not a bad thing.
Hmm.
It's a program
Hmm.
to help people get back on their feet
Hmm.
and afford to live somewhere safe, just like how we started this conversation,
Right.
right? A lot of our community issues can be
Hmm.
solved starting with access to safe and secure housing.
Hmm.
And isn't that ultimately what we want, right? So you
For
start
sure.
with housing and then you move on to access to
Hmm.
fresh and affordable food. And
Hmm.
then you move on to access
Hmm.
to good and affordable education. And now you
Yeah.
start to see whole communities that are changing for the better. That's what everybody wants
Hmm.
ultimately.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I've personally not ever rented to a Section 8 tenant, but kind of going back to what you mentioned, where people are on a waiting list for years, I think that there's something to that, and that,
Mhm.
the tenants it might be counterintuitive to what some landlords think, that they're not going to take care of the house, when in fact that's highly important to them. So they're going to
Correct.
take great care of the house or the
Correct.
apartment property.
Correct. I once did a ride along with one of my police departments,
Ah.
and we were driving through a community, and it was filled with apartments, and a lot of it was Section 8
Mhm.
voucher housing, and the officer was telling me, this is considered one of the tougher communities, and
Mm.
he said, but I love coming here. The people are really friendly,
Mhm.
and I said, well, look at the balconies.
Mm.
And we looked at the balconies, and there were flowers on the balconies, right?
Ah.
And he said, people who don't care
Mhm.
don't have flowers.
Hmm.
People who feel safe and care have decorated balconies. They put
Mhm.
out flowers. They are
Wow.
investing time. And so I think that's what we have to start remembering
Mhm.
is just because someone does not earn as much
Mhm.
as another person in the community does not mean
Mhm.
that they lead a life of crime. They care just as much. They're just not as affluent. So how can we make a welcoming community and space for them where
Mhm.
they don't feel like outsiders?
Wow, that was pretty awesome. Thank you. So, thinking back to something we were talking about a minute ago, where you were talking about the intent behind different ordinances and different things. In speaking to real estate investors, if you can imagine, whatever situation that there's an ordinance that's problematic based on what someone is intending to do as an investor, what would you encourage them to do? What action would you recommend that they would take to try to work with whatever, relevant municipality, et cetera, to try to find a solution to be able to make things happen?
I am a big, big believer in talking to the local leadership,
Mhm.
whether that is a city council, a
Mhm.
village board, a state representative, if the
Mhm.
issue lies somewhere, further up the chain, but going to them and saying, hey, this ordinance
Mhm.
is preventing this business
Mhm.
from coming here and moving forward and bringing housing.
Mhm.
So, how can we solve for the problem that you are concerned with
Mhm.
while also encouraging investment and development, I should say,
Mhm.
in the community?
Mhm.
Having those conversations is so helpful because sometimes things are on the books
Mhm.
and people forgot.
Mhm.
They are old. They
Wow.
might not even know it's there. So
Wow.
sometimes you're raising an issue
Mhm.
that people didn't even realize was an issue. So rather than seeing that and letting that be a stopping point where you
Mhm.
think, okay, well, I'm just not going to invest here, I'm going to go somewhere else,
Mhm.
start talking to the leadership in the community to see if you can get it changed.
Mm-hmm. And have those conversations. Now, what about when it comes to tax incentives, things like that that could be done by various municipalities to encourage, development, revitalization, things like that? I know I've worked with some investors in a
Mhm.
couple of different, locations, and you can see sometimes night and day. Not that one is not welcoming, but not as proactive as others.
Right.
Any thoughts or words of wisdom for investors that you would share on some of those issues?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of programs that exist
Mhm.
across the state. Some of them relate to residential development, some to commercial development. And I think looking at what a community has versus what you think they need,
Mhm.
and then again, going back to those community leaders, right?
Mhm.
A lot of times with those, starting in the community planning
Mhm.
department and saying, hey, here's how we think you are being held back
Mhm.
from more development in your area because community X, Y, or Z
Mhm.
is offering these additional things while being mindful that any community is going to want you to be a good neighbor,
Right.
right? And so there's only going to be so much that they can and should do.
Mhm.
We don't want to create a race to the bottom because there are impacts to the rest of the community, right? So every dollar that doesn't get paid in property taxes by one property, whether that's through a senior exemption or right, somebody else is going to make that payment, right?
Sure.
They may not realize it's not a dollar for dollar, but somebody else is going to make that payment. And so, how can you find that balance of being a good neighbor while also incentivizing other developers to come in? We've seen here in Arlington Heights, we've seen success with TIF districts, and we don't have that many. Over time, I think we've only had somewhere in the neighborhood of 6. And a lot of times they've ended early. At the very least, they've ended on time. And I think that's important because they've served their purpose. They've led to a lot of development, which then continues on past the life of the TIF district.
Sure.
And that's exactly how they should be working.
Right.
Downtown Arlington Heights was really built up through a TIF district, right? But the TIF district is now closed,
right?
Because it served its purpose. That property is now valuable property. It is revenue generating property for the community. There's housing, there are restaurants, there are shops, there's all kinds of things. So the likelihood that someone, in the community, that the village board would put another TIF there, it seems unlikely to me. But there are other areas of Arlington Heights that are under a TIF now because they need that same kind of boost. So we see it in the southern end of town, right? As they're trying to build up the southern corridor, and there's some housing that will now go in onto that TIF property, and that will all start to get built up. And so I think looking for those opportunities and really trying to tailor what it is that you need, as opposed to trying to do big, expansive sort of land grabs, where the community itself, on the whole, gets harmed in some way. I think is really important. How can you be that community partner and make those suggestions?
Wow. Now, what about opportunity zones? Where would you say that factors into all of this?
So, I mean, that really depends on where you are in the state. Sometimes not just within a municipality, but like in terms of the municipality as a whole, sometimes it's the municipality within the municipality. You know what I mean? Like in Arlington Heights, we've got sort of the southern corridor and central sort of downtown, and then we've got the northern end of town. Those are wildly different areas of one municipality. And I think you have to take all of that into account when you're looking to incentivize developers and investors to come. They need different things in different parts of town. So you want to make sure that by doing an incentive in one area of town, you're not causing harm to the others, right? But that you're also building up what's actually needed there and not forcing out people who need to stay in the community.
Wow. This has been great. I really appreciate it. Wow. Guys, Mary Beth Canty, she is an open book. Feel free to follow her online. She has wonderful newsletters that come out. And, I just appreciate all that you do for Arlington Heights, for the state, and really just, one of the things I didn't mention, Mary Beth is an attorney by trade. So, I've been with her on the campaign trail and, just for different causes. And I'm always impressed by the thoughtful and well-educated answers she has to any question you throw at her. So she really is a treasure. I'm glad to call her a friend and part of our community.
The feeling is so mutual. Thank you. Thank you for all that you do. You are amazing in your own right. So thank you. And thank you for having me today.
Thanks, everyone.